There are two numbers in this video, and both of them are true. The first is 44. That is the top of the forecast range for Dubai this week. Daily highs between 39 and 44 degrees Celsius, an average of 41, and overnight lows that rarely drop below 31. The second is 40. That is the core body temperature at which a doctor stops calling it heat exhaustion and starts calling it heat stroke. Above 40 degrees, measured inside your body, the diagnosis changes, and so does the survival rate. You run at 37. So the entire margin between a normal human being and a medical emergency is 3 degrees. And here is the part almost nobody knows. Your own body closes that gap without any help from the weather. At complete rest, doing nothing. Your basal metabolism produces roughly 100 kilocalories of heat every hour. If your cooling systems stop working, not slow down, stop, that waste heat alone raises your core temperature by about 1.1 degrees per hour. Strenuous physical work can push heat production past 1,000 kilocalories an hour, more than 10 times faster. Sit still in a sealed room with no cooling and you cross into heat stroke in under 3 hours. Work in it and you get there in under 20 minutes. You are the furnace. The outside temperature only decides whether you can vent. What follows is the exact order in which a body comes apart when it cannot vent. Which organ goes first? Which one actually kills you? And which one waits 3 days before it does? Every stage of this is documented in the clinical literature. Every stage of it is also, up to a point, completely reversible. That last part matters more than anything else in this video. Start with the machine you actually are. Your body is not good at handling heat. It is spectacular at it, but only under one condition. Blood carries core heat outward to your skin, and skin releases it into the air by 4 routes: radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. The first 3 work by moving heat from something hot to something cooler. They require the air to be colder than you are. At 44 degrees, the air is not colder than you are. It is 7 degrees hotter. Radiation, conduction, and convection do not simply stop, they reverse. The air starts depositing heat into you, which leaves one system. Evaporation. Sweat is the only cooling mechanism you have left once ambient temperature exceeds skin temperature. It runs on a beautiful piece of physics, turning a gram of water from liquid to vapor, absorbs roughly 580 calories of heat. And it takes that energy directly out of your skin. A well-adapted human can sweat 1 to 2 liters an hour and shed enormous quantities of heat doing it. But evaporation needs somewhere for the water to go. The air has to be able to accept it. This is where the Gulf becomes the problem, and it is why 44 degrees in Dubai is not the same event as 44 degrees in Phoenix or Riyadh. The Arabian Gulf is exceptionally shallow, averaging around 35 meters, so it heats through its entire depth every summer instead of burying the warmth the way a deep ocean does. By July, its surface routinely sits above 33 degrees. That is a bath, hundreds of kilometers wide, evaporating continuously into the air that then blows across the coast. Coastal humidity in the UAE regularly reaches 85%. At 85% humidity, the air is close to saturated. Your sweat comes out and sits there. You are losing water, salt, and blood volume and getting almost nothing back for it. You have switched on your only remaining system, and it is running with the exhaust blocked. Now add the 2 conditions that decide who actually dies, because they are not the ones people expect. The first is the night. Heat physiology is not a daily reset. Your body offloads accumulated heat overnight, and that recovery window is what allows you to survive a second hot day and a third. Dubai's overnight lows in July rarely drop below 31 degrees. That is warmer than a heated swimming pool held for 8 hours every night for 3 months. At 31 degrees ambient with high humidity, a body at rest sheds very little. The recovery window never fully opens. Heat load accumulates across days rather than resetting each morning, which is why mortality in prolonged heat events climbs on day 3 and day 4 rather than on day 1. The killer is rarely the peak temperature. It is the absence of a floor. The second condition is how long you have been there. The body genuinely adapts to heat. Repeated exposure produces real physiological change over 7 to 14 days. Sweating starts earlier and produces more volume. Sweat carries less electrolyte, circulation stabilizes, and you can perform the same work at a lower core temperature and a lower heart rate. An acclimatized worker is a fundamentally different organism from an unacclimatized one, which makes the occupational data brutal. Cal/OSHA reports that at least half of recorded heat illness incidents and deaths occurred in unacclimatized workers. Almost half of reported cases happened on the worker's first day on the job. 80% happened within the first 4 days, not the hottest day, the first day. OSHA's guidance is the rule of 20%. A new worker should spend no more than 20% of a shift in the heat on day 1, increasing by no more than 20% daily. Acclimatization also decays. A week away from heat and the adaptations start to disappear, which means a worker returning from leave is close to a new worker again. Now the sequence itself. The first organ to fail is your brain, and it fails early enough to remove your ability to save yourself. Heat stroke has a formal definition: core temperature above 40.0 degrees Celsius, accompanied by central nervous system dysfunction. Note the structure of that sentence. The neurological symptom is not a complication. It is part of the diagnosis. You cannot have heat stroke without it. Neurons are extraordinarily temperature sensitive. Above 40 degrees, enzyme function degrades, cell membranes destabilize, and the blood-brain barrier begins to leak. Simultaneously, your cardiovascular system is diverting blood to the skin to dump heat, so cerebral blood flow falls exactly when the brain most needs perfusion. The result is a specific and constantly misread presentation. Confusion, slurred speech, stumbling gait, irritability, sometimes aggression, poor judgment, combativeness. Every one of those looks like drunkenness, and bystanders read it as drunkenness routinely. There are documented cases of collapsing workers being walked away from help because colleagues assumed they were intoxicated or simply being difficult. The person experiencing it cannot correct anyone because the organ they would use to recognize the emergency is the organ currently failing. That is the cruel architecture of heat stroke. The first casualty is the judgment required to escape. Then there is the myth. Almost everyone has heard that when you stop sweating, that is the danger sign. It is a half-truth that gets people killed. Hot, dry skin is common in classic heat stroke, the kind that takes elderly people during heat waves. But in exertional heat stroke, the kind that takes healthy adults working outdoors, roughly half of patients are still sweating heavily when they collapse. Waiting for sweating to stop means waiting past the point where cooling still works. The reliable sign is not the skin, it is the behavior. Confusion in extreme heat is heat stroke until proven otherwise. While that is happening, your heart is being asked to do something it cannot sustain. Cooling requires blood at the skin. Working muscle requires blood too. Blood pressure requires enough volume to fill the system, and you are losing volume through sweat at up to 2 liters an hour. The heart's answer is to raise cardiac output enormously. Heart rate climbs, stroke volume strains, while circulating volume falls, and the vessels in the skin dilate wide open. It is being asked to pump more fluid, faster, through a larger space, with less fluid available. Meanwhile, the myocardium itself is heat sensitive. The clinical literature documents heat stroke induced myocardial injury as a distinct entity, driven by systemic inflammation, endothelial damage, disturbed cardiac metabolism, and dysregulated heat shock proteins. Cardiovascular stability is closely tied to the severity of the whole illness. The heart is both a victim of heat stroke and the system whose failure determines how fast everything else collapses. Eventually, output falls, perfusion pressure drops, and every organ downstream starts receiving less blood at the moment its oxygen demand is highest. Which brings us to the organ that actually kills you, and it is one nobody thinks about in this context at all. It is your gut. When the body is fighting heat, it makes a triage decision. Blood is finite, and it needs to reach the skin, so it constricts the splanchnic circulation, the vessels supplying the stomach, intestines, and abdominal organs, and reroutes that blood outward. Splanchnic vasoconstriction is entirely appropriate in a short heat challenge. Sustained, it starves the lining of your intestine of oxygen. That lining is 1 cell thick. A single layer of epithelium is the only barrier between your bloodstream and the contents of your bowel, which include an enormous population of gram-negative bacteria. Those bacteria carry a molecule in their outer membrane called lipopolysaccharide, LPs, also known as endotoxin. Starve that one-cell barrier of oxygen and it becomes permeable. The junctions between cells loosen. LPs begins crossing from your intestine into your blood. Your immune system is exquisitely tuned to detect LPs because endotoxin in the bloodstream normally means one thing: catastrophic bacterial infection. Immune cells bind it through a receptor called TLR4 and respond the only way they know how, with a massive release of inflammatory cytokines. Researchers now call this heat sepsis, and it is why the modern understanding of heat stroke looks nothing like the old one. For most of medical history, heat stroke was understood as heat cooking tissue. Direct thermal damage. Simple, but that model never explained the clinical picture, why patients kept deteriorating after being cooled, why the presentation looked so much like septic shock, why organ failure continued progressing days later. The current framework is the dual pathway model. It proposes that heat stroke is driven by two separate mechanisms along a temperature continuum. Below roughly 42 degrees core temperature, the dominant driver is heat sepsis, endotoxin-triggered systemic inflammation. Above 42, direct heat toxicity takes over. Where thermal energy alone is enough to destroy cells, heat sepsis comes first. And in the current literature, endotoxemia of intestinal origin is increasingly considered the lead driver of severe organ damage and the main cause of death in heat stroke patients. So the thing that kills you in a heat wave is not, strictly speaking, the heat. It is your own immune system responding correctly to bacterial fragments that escaped your intestine because your body sacrificed its gut lining trying to save you. Once that cascade is running, it moves into the blood itself, specifically into the system that decides whether your blood stays liquid. Damaged cells release molecules called DAMPs, damage-associated molecular patterns. In heat stroke, the significant ones are MGB1, free histones, and loose DINA. These are internal components that should never circulate freely. When they appear in the bloodstream, they amplify inflammation further and directly injure the endothelium, the single cell lining of every blood vessel in your body. Damaged endothelium exposes tissue factor. Tissue factor initiates clotting, and so your blood begins clotting everywhere at once. This is disseminated intravascular coagulation, DIC, and it is one of the most feared complications in critical care. Microscopic clots form throughout the small vessels, blocking supply to tissue that is already heat-stressed and already oxygen-starved. Then comes the paradox that makes DIC so lethal. Clotting everywhere consumes your platelets and clotting factors. Within hours, you run out. A patient who was clotting uncontrollably becomes a patient who cannot clot at all. The clinical picture is bleeding and clotting simultaneously. Blood from IV sites that will not stop. Bruising spreading across the skin. Gastrointestinal bleeding. Meanwhile, the microcirculation is still choked. No single treatment fixes both directions at once, which is why DIC and heat stroke carries such a grim prognosis. While the blood is doing that, the muscles are doing something else. Skeletal muscle is among the most heat-sensitive tissue in the body. Above roughly 41 degrees, muscle cell membranes break down and the cells rupture. This is rhabdomyolysis, and it dumps the entire intracellular contents of muscle into circulation, potassium, phosphate, creatine kinase, and a large iron-containing protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin is the problem. It is filtered by the kidney, and in the acidic, concentrated urine of a dehydrated heat stroke patient, it precipitates into obstructive casts inside the renal tubules. It is also directly toxic to the tubular cells. So the kidney is hit from 3 directions simultaneously: reduced blood flow from cardiovascular collapse, physical obstruction from myoglobin casts, and direct chemical injury. Acute kidney injury is one of the most common serious complications of heat stroke, and the potassium released from ruptured muscle can produce fatal cardiac arrhythmias on its own. The lungs join late and badly. Systemic inflammation increases vascular permeability throughout the body, and in the lungs, that means fluid crossing into the alveoli. acute respiratory distress syndrome. The patient is now failing to oxygenate blood that is already clotting in a body that is already inflamed. At this point, they have been unwell for perhaps 2 hours. Then there is the organ that waits. Liver injury and heat stroke does not present immediately. Transaminases, the enzymes that indicate liver cell damage, typically peak between 24 and 72 hours after the initial event. A patient can be cooled, stabilized, look reasonable, and be moving toward discharge while their liver is quietly failing behind them. Severe cases progress to fulminant hepatic failure, requiring transplantation days after the heat event ended. The delayed liver is why heat stroke is not an event. It is a process with a tail. Now here is where this story turns, and where most videos on this subject get it badly wrong. Because almost everything described above is preventable, and the evidence is not ambiguous. Heat stroke mortality without rapid intervention runs at roughly 80%. With early recognition and rapid cooling, that figure drops to approximately 10%. Studies show that promptly treated patients return to healthy organ function by clinical and biological markers, not damaged and managed, but recovered. An 8-fold reduction in death from one intervention. The intervention is cooling, and specifically cooling that is fast. The clinical target is to bring core temperature below roughly 39 degrees within 30 minutes of collapse. The gold standard is cold water immersion, putting the person in a tub of ice water. It is crude, it is unglamorous, and nothing else comes close. Where immersion is unavailable, the alternative is continuous cold water dousing plus aggressive fanning, ice packs to neck, armpits and groin, and clothing removed. The instruction that saves the most lives is the one most people get backwards. Cool first, transport second. Every minute above 40 degrees en route to a hospital is another minute of cellular damage. Elite sports medicine and military protocols now teach cool first explicitly. Everything else, the endotoxin cascade, DIC, rhabdomyolysis, the delayed liver, is what happens when nobody starts the clock in time. Which brings us to what happens when a society gets this right, and what happens to the people left outside the system. The Way runs one of the most institutionalized heat protection regimes on Earth. The Occupational Heat Stress Prevention Policy, the midday break, has operated every summer since 2004 and is in its 22nd consecutive year. From 15 June to 15 September, no outdoor work in direct sunlight is permitted between 12:30 and 3:00. 93 consecutive days, weekends and public holidays included. Employers face fines of 5,000 dirhams per worker in violation, to a maximum of 50,000, and are expected to monitor wet bulb globe temperature on site. More than 12,000 air-conditioned rest stations have been built nationwide for delivery riders alone. That is a functioning heat public health system, and it exists because the physics above is understood by the people running it. Now look at what happened 400 kilometers away when access to that kind of system was uneven. Between 14 and 19 June 2024, during the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, at least 1,301 people died of heat. Saudi authorities treated more than 2,700 cases of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, with 2,764 non-fatal injuries recorded on 16 June alone. Peak temperature reported at the Grand Mosque was 51.8 degrees. The detail that matters is not the temperature, it is the distribution. Around 83% of the dead were unauthorized pilgrims, people who had traveled without permits and therefore without hotel rooms, without official transport, and without access to the air-conditioned shelters that had been provided. Of 658 Egyptian pilgrims who died, 630 were unregistered. They walked long distances in direct sun and had nowhere cool to return to. Same city, same heat. Radically different survival, sorted by paperwork. Heat does not kill democratically. It kills whoever is outside the cooled system, and that has been true of every major heat disaster in modern history. Then there is the finding from that Hajj that should reset how you think about all of this. For a decade, the reference number for lethal heat has been a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees. The theoretical threshold above which a healthy human cannot shed heat at all, proposed in 2010 and modeled for the Gulf in a 2015 Nature Climate Change paper by Jeremy Powell and El Fatih El Tahir. During the 6 days of the 2024 Hajj, wet bulb temperatures peaked at 29.5 degrees, not 35, 29.5, more than 5 degrees below the supposed survival limit, and 1,301 people died. Researchers analyzing the event found that the upper limits of human heat tolerance were breached for a cumulative 43 hours across those 6 days, despite never approaching 35 wet bulb. The conclusion in the current literature is blunt. The true limit is considerably lower than 35 for real human beings, because 35 assumes a fit young adult, naked, in shade, in moving air, doing nothing. Add age. Add cardiovascular disease. Add clothing. Add walking 6 to 21 kilometers a day, which is what the Hajj requires. The theoretical number was never a threshold. It was a ceiling nobody was going to reach alive, and the trajectory is not favorable. The Middle East is warming at nearly twice the global average rate. Analysis of the 2024 event indicates that at 2 degrees of global warming, heat stroke risk during the Hajj would be roughly 10 times higher. Because the Islamic calendar is lunar, the pilgrimage drifts through the solar year, and in about 25 years, it cycles back into August and September, the peak of Saudi summer. One last thing, for the people who survive. Recovery from heat stroke is not always complete. The clinical literature now describes long-term cardiovascular consequences as a delayed outcome of the illness. Survivors carry elevated risk well after the acute episode resolves, and some neurological deficits from the initial brain injury never fully clear. A person discharged after heat stroke has not simply had a bad week. They have had a systemic inflammatory event with a measurable tail. 3 questions come out of all of this. If 29.5 wet bulb killed 1,301 people in a country with field hospitals and thousands of deployed paramedics, what is the number that should actually trigger emergency protocols, and why is nobody publishing it? The UAE's midday break ends at 3 p.m. because 3 p.m. is enforceable. Not because the heat stops. Ground surface temperatures lag air temperature and often peak later. What is the medical justification for that specific hour? And how many heat deaths across the Gulf are currently recorded as cardiac arrest, kidney failure, or liver failure, because the patient died 24 to 72 hours later, at the tail end of a process that started outdoors? Nobody has answered any of them. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon in Dubai, the 24th of July, the airport is reporting 41 degrees with humidity at 27%. It feels like 43. The northwesterly shamal is still blowing, which is the only reason the humidity is that low, and the National Center of Meteorology has forecast a 98% probability of El Niño conditions through November, a pattern historically associated with weaker shamal winds. Offshore, the Gulf is holding above 33 degrees and will not cool meaningfully until November. Tonight, it will not drop below 31 in the city. Somewhere out there right now, a shift is restarting. The rule says the break ended at 3. The forecast says 44 by the end of the week. And somewhere on that site is a man who arrived this month, who is on day 3, who is inside the window where 80% of these cases happen and does not know it. He is carrying a furnace that produces 100 kilocalories an hour whether he works or not, cooled by a single system that requires the air to accept water. 3 degrees of margin. 1.1 degrees an hour. The clock does not start when the heat arrives. It starts when the sweat stops working.